First Language Acquisition, Chapter 1 of Essential Linguistics, What You Need to Know to Teach, by Kyle Gouveia, Jason Johnson, Sean Aguirre, and Marissa Martinez. As teachers, it is important to reflect on our experiences with language. By studying different perspectives on language, we can begin to form our own beliefs about how language is developed. We can begin to answer questions like, is language acquired naturally, or is it learned through a conscious process? How do researchers from different fields study language development? What do linguists say about first language acquisition? Such questions will be considered as language acquisition is discussed in this presentation. There are numerous theories and ideas surrounding the acquisition and development of language. The behaviorist view of language was the generally accepted theory in the first half of the 20th century. Behaviorists argued that language is developed through immediate positive reinforcement of sounds and utterances. For example, when a child utters a sound like baba and his mother gives him a bottle, it increases the likelihood of the sound reoccurring. In simple terms, whatever is reinforced is repeated. As utterances develop into words and words into sentences, positive reinforcement of language behavior eventually leads to proficiency. As children grow, they imitate the sounds and words adults use. Attempts are rewarded and language is further developed. The leading behaviorist of the time was B.F. Skinner, who in 1957 wrote the book Verbal Behavior. In his book, Skinner discusses human language learning within the theories of behaviorism. In 1959, Chomsky wrote a review of Skinner's book. Chomsky argued that the behaviorist view was too narrow an approach to language development. Chomsky presented the idea that language was too complex to be learned simply through reinforcement. The 1970s saw the behaviorist view of language give way to cognitive science. Within this science are theories encompassing biological, neurological, and social development of humans. In 1987, Lindfors presented various arguments to debunk behaviorist view of language development. Lindfors pointed out that behaviorism did not account for the uniform development of language across environments, or why humans were the only intelligent beings who learned to speak. Lindfors also closely examined children's speech and noted many common grammatical mistakes, which proves that children do not simply imitate adult speech and language. Finally, Lindfors presented the idea that language is a complex system learned in a short time, which behaviorism has not been able to explain. More recently, researchers have found that there are many different aspects behind language acquisition. The focus of recent studies has been on the child and the child's capacity for learning. Educators, sociologists, linguists, psychologists, and anthropologists have extensively studied the influence of environmental setting and social context in the development of language and communication. Research continues to uncover the complexities of language acquisition within respective fields of study. More specifically, research considers child language acquisition centered in three areas: the child, the environment, and language. Developmental psychology tries to answer the question, do children learn language the same way they learn other things, or do humans have a special capacity for language learning? Studies across language groups show that all children seem to develop language in much the same way and go through similar stages. The developmental stages include babbling, production of syllables with CV structure at 7 to 8 months, single words for important objects at 1 year, two-word utterances at 18 months, and beyond 2 years, language grows so rapidly that children begin to understand syntax. In addition, studies showed that children acquire sign language in much the same way as children acquire oral language, thus proving that children have an innate ability to learn language. Sociology, anthropology, and education try and answer the question, what are social forces that shape language development, and how can social institutions promote language development? Children develop what Himes termed communicative competence, the ability to use language appropriately in different social situations. This may include how to act in the classroom, or what to do when you're out on the playground for recess. Studies that focused on interactions between caregivers and children showed that adults often imitate children rather than children imitating adults. One study showed the importance of encouraging children to initiate and sustain conversations rather than correcting them. Other studies of 3 different speech communities found very different interaction patterns among the children and adults in these communities. They considered the differences between how children interact in the home community as well as in the school. Linguistics intends to answer the question, what is the nature of the language that children develop? Different theories of linguistics have led to different theories of language acquisition. Behavioral psychology and structural linguistics were used together to form theories about language learning. Structural linguists describe sentence patterns of oral language. Cognitive psychology and generative linguistics were used to form more current theories of language acquisition. Chomsky argues that children acquire basic knowledge of phonology and syntax early in life. They internalize a set of rules that allows them to comprehend and generate utterances. Chomsky's model of language includes a surface structure and a deep structure. Children acquire the rules for deep structure and additional rules to transform deep structure forms into surface structure forms. Chomsky based this theory in part on his observations that some sentences are structurally ambiguous. Chomsky argues that children are born with an innate knowledge of the basic structures of language, what he terms universal grammar, which we'll get into more detail later, and that humans have a language acquisition device, a capacity to use language input to figure out the rules of any given language through a process referred to as a parameter setting. Studies of children's errors help confirm Chomsky's theory. Children simply don't make certain kinds of errors, and this suggests that they learn language differently from how they learn other things. Let's talk more about universal grammar. Universal grammar is a theory that says that there are certain fundamental grammatical commonalities which all humans possess without having to learn them. Universal grammar explains how language acquisition works in humans by showing the most basic rules that all languages have to follow. Universal grammar does not attempt to lay out many blanket statements that hold true for every single language on Earth. Instead, what a universal grammar seeks to do is to lay out propositions of the form, if X is true, then Y will be true. These structures lay out how all language develops when faced with certain basic principles. Using these structures, students of universal grammar can attempt to state what word order a language might choose, what phonemes will be present, and other foundational traits of the language. Generative grammar, which was also originated from works of Noam Chomsky, is a branch of theoretical linguistics that works to provide a set of rules that it can accurately predict which combinations of words are able to make grammatically correct sentences. Most versions of generative grammar characterize sentences as either grammatically correct or not. The rules of a generative grammar typically function as an algorithm to predict grammatically as a discrete yes or no result. Another way to consider the idea that humans have an innate capacity for language is to say that all human languages are reflections of some properties of the human mind. As early as 1861, Paul Broca identified an area in the left frontal lobe that was responsible for language. Damage to that area impaired language functioning. This area of the brain came to be known as Broca's area. 10 years later, Carl Wernicke discovered that an area in the posterior of the left hemisphere affected speech comprehension. Subsequent studies have confirmed that most language processing takes place in the left hemisphere. However, studies on people that had received brain damage in some way showed results that sometimes other parts of the brain take over if speech is not functioning correctly in the left hemisphere. Thus, although language function seems to be located in specific areas, the brain is sufficiently interconnected so that other areas can take on certain functions. Linguists, however, do not claim that children are born with explicit knowledge of language. The knowledge that children have is implicit, not explicit. Children may be born knowing that the language they hear will contain something like nouns and verbs, but they cannot name the parts of speech or underline all the nouns in the sentence. They may have something they call the language instinct. In conclusion, children can make meaning through different modalities, and they can adjust their meaning making to different social situations. Studies by sociologists and anthropologists show differences among the ways social and economic groups within a society use language for communication. Children acquire communicative competence, the ability to use language that is appropriate for the group into which they are socialized. Children are able to internalize a set of rules that lets them understand and produce sentences they have never heard before. This shows that language learning is not simply imitation. The fact that children can develop these rules with minimal input and virtually no correction suggests that humans are born with an innate capacity for acquiring language.